Welcome to the IAPP Web Conference, Processing DSRs, Lessons from the Early Days of CCPA, brought to you today by Securiti.ai. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm the IAPP's Knowledge Manager, and I'll be your host for today's web conference. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, I'd like to cover a couple of quick program details. By participating in today's program, certified IAPP privacy professionals who are the named registrants will automatically be granted 1 CPE credit. Others who are listening in can apply for those credits through an easy-to-use online form on our website. I'd also like to remind you that today's program is being recorded and will be provided free to registered attendees approximately 48 hours following live event. I encourage you to ask questions at any time during the program by typing them into the Q&A field. It's just to the right of your PowerPoint window. Your questions will be answered by the presenters during a dedicated question and answer period following the presentation. Now on to our program. I would like to introduce today's panelists. Marissa Levinson is Vice President and Associate General Counsel at QuinStreet. Marissa, welcome to the panel, and greetings from Seattle, I believe. And please tell us a little bit about your role over there and your professional background.
Well, thank you. First, I just want to say I hope everyone listening is well and staying healthy. January 1st, when the CCPA took effect, sort of seems like a lifetime ago now. But I'm the Associate General Counsel for QuinStreet. And at QuinStreet, responsibility for data privacy compliance falls under the legal function. So my team led the company-wide rollout of our CCPA program. Before I joined QuinStreet, I actually spent many years on the business side. Among other things, I ran Movable Type, the enterprise division of a blogging and CMS software company. And before that, I managed some of Bloomberg's consumer-facing media. Excellent.
Thanks, Marissa. And joining us on the panel today, Mark Roe is a Solutions Architect at Securiti.ai. And Mark, can you tell us a bit about your role over there at Securiti.ai?
Sure. Yep, absolutely. My name is Mark Roe, and as Dave mentioned, I'm a Solution Architect with Securiti.ai based out of Chicago. Spent the first 12 years of my career in various roles in the managed security services space, so I was able to get intimately familiar with many different types of cybersecurity technologies. I then made the jump into sales engineering with companies like WebSense, Bluecoat, and Symantec, where I was really given the opportunity to start focusing on data protection solutions, which has really proven pretty valuable as I made the jump from cybersecurity into the privacy space.
Terrific. Thanks, Mark. And with that, let's move on to the program itself, and I'm going to hand it over to Mark. Mark, it's in your hands.
Yep. Thank you, Dave. And thanks as well to the IAPP for having us today, and also to you, Marissa, for your willingness to share your valuable insights here. And so, Marissa, for our viewers that may not be familiar, could you give us a bit of background about the QuinStreet business model?
Sure. So QuinStreet is a digital marketplace and technology platform where consumers can come and research and compare offers for high consideration products like insurance policies, personal loans. So a consumer can come and find information about products through our services, and they can submit an inquiry or express an interest about a product. And then our algorithms and AI will find the most interesting offers that we have available for them from our clients. So we interact with consumers through a whole number of channels, the websites, our own websites, those of our media partners, through our call centers, emails, and other channels. So we touch a large number of consumers across a number of channels.
Nice. And what did you notice when CCPA went into effect back in January in terms of volume of the subject rights requests that you received, and then also what are the different types of requests?
So looking at the volume, we received hundreds of requests in the first few weeks. The number of new requests per day has decreased since then, luckily, but we're still now getting about a dozen a day. In terms of the type, the overwhelming majority of the requests we get are opt-out requests, the do not sell my information type requests. And that may be a reflection of our own business. Most of the consumer data that we hold was given to us directly by the consumer for the express purpose of sharing it with our clients. So they don't necessarily need or want us to provide that information back to them. And it seems like mostly they just want to opt out of further sharing, and maybe that's because they're no longer in market for a product.
Gotcha. And really, what are some of the challenges with regards to locating and then identifying consumer data as your organization started to fulfill all these subject rights requests?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest challenge in complying with the CCPA is, of course, understanding what consumer data you have and where it is. So it's basic data mapping and data inventory, but it's been made a lot more complex because of the CCPA's new expanded definition of personal information. So you're now looking for sort of new types of consumer data in new places that you may not have been doing before. So for us, we really faced 4 main issues going through this process. The first one is that our consumer data, like I'm sure is the case for many others, is located in a number of different data stores, and you have to make sure that you're looking for it in each of those places. So we collect consumer information, as I said, through a number of channels. So if a consumer visits one of our websites, we're going to collect a certain amount of data about that visit, and that data is stored in one place. Now, if a consumer then submits a request for a product, that information is stored in another place. And we also have an email database and a call center database and so on. So different pieces of information about a consumer are in different places. We've also grown through acquisition, so sometimes we have more than one type of each of those data stores. So the first challenge was really to think through all of the ways in which we interact with consumers to understand all the different types of data that we're collecting and where that information is stored. A second difficult issue that we found was resolving identity across those data sources, meaning, can you actually tie the consumer information that you find in these various places back to a single consumer and a single request? So with this new broadened definition of personal information, which is now any information that can be reasonably linked directly or indirectly with a person or household, you're looking for data that may not necessarily be tied to a name. And then sometimes, in our case at least, a consumer could look differently in different data sources. So sometimes we have 2 different email addresses with a name, or maybe the consumer gave us 2 different phone numbers at different touch points. So, we try, of course, to assign unique identifiers to consumers throughout their journey and throughout their touch points with our organization. But because not all of our systems were created at the same time, or even within the same company, we don't always have that unique identifier. So we may have the data about a website visit, which only has an IP address, but if that same consumer then calls into our call center, we may have information about that call with a telephone number, but we may not have an obvious tie. So we had to spend some time figuring out how and whether we could reasonably tie all of the information we have together back to a particular consumer who was making a request. We also encountered another issue, which was tied to the labeling of data, and this occurred really as we tried to automate as much of the response process as we could. So, and this is really an issue with our some of the relational databases. So at a high level, it should be simple, right? You have databases, and you have tables and columns and rows, and there should be sort of consistent labeling of your columns. Column 1 is labeled email, and it has rows of email addresses, and column 2 is labeled zip code, and it has rows of zip codes. So if you get a consumer request, you can retrieve the information in those columns, and you know what it is. But in our case, what we found is sometimes we had tables that had columns that were called variable 1 and then variable 2. And then in each of those rows, it was inconsistent data. So depending on where the consumer entered the flow with us, variable 1 could be something like zip code, or it could be name of the other person you want insured. So there's a good business reason behind the way we set that up. But it did mean that when we tried to automate some of the responses, we had to go and look at that, and that was sort of an unexpected challenge. And then I would say the final challenge for us is really identifying and quickly understanding the capacity in which you hold data. So to borrow from GDPR terms, at QuinStreet, we hold data mostly as a controller, but sometimes we hold it as a service provider. So again, in our effort to automate responses, it was important for us to be able to quickly identify whether a piece of data we found was held in our capacity of controller or as a service provider, because it then triggered a different type of process and response process. So those were really the four main issues that we encountered for having to do with data discovery.
Yeah, thanks for that. Very insightful. And so, it's often said that business solutions really require people, process, and also technology. What advice could you offer around the people and process part of that equation?
Yeah, well, to deploy a CCPA program, we found obviously we needed the involvement of so many different groups within our company. So we had close to 40 people involved in the process at one point or another. So that includes the various system administrators, your database administrators, the technical leads for each business unit who know what columns and what tables the data resides in. We needed each of the business teams, like the email team, the SMS team. We needed the information security team because, and we'll discuss this, I think, further along in the presentation, but we installed Securiti.ai's bots into our databases, so we needed InfoSec involved. You need the web teams to implement the consumer request prompts, the teams that interface directly with the consumers, our call centers and so on, our HR department, and then of course legal. So that's a lot of people, and all of those people of course have full-time jobs and priorities that do not involve CCPA. So you really need buy-in from the top of the organization so that everybody understands why that it's important and that they can devote the time to it. And then, like all big projects that get deployed across an organization, you need good project management. You need a project management and a project manager who can clearly articulate to the team members what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why and how they're involved, and when you're going to need their help and what the expected time commitment will be. So for us at QuinStreet, I think our job was made a little easier because even prior to CCPA, we've had for a while a strong focus on consumer data compliance, and we'd already deployed resources and compliance tools across the company. So there was a little bit of, so that helped, as we went through this process again.
Great. And then also the last part of the equation, how can technology be applied to help address these data discovery challenges?
Well, from my experience, if you're a company of a certain size, I would say a technology solution to data discovery is not just a help, but it really is, it's a must. I mean, complying with CCPA is going to stretch a manual process to the brink. Data maps and inventories by spreadsheet in this environment is really quickly unmanageable. So for us, the technology solution, and we implemented Securiti.ai's PrivacyOps, really helped us in two main ways. The first is implementing and having bots and AI searching your databases for consumer data instead of having humans querying databases. They can do it a lot better and a lot faster. And the second one is also having those AIs help you resolve your identity issues. It's really about automating that discovery process. So, as I mentioned at QuinStreet, before CCPA, we already had a process in place to search for consumer records, but even that process still involves, submitting a request to one team who submitted a request to another team. Somebody had to schedule and then run a query, and then the results were presented back. And that works if you're getting, one request for a record every few weeks. But when you're getting 12, 20 or more a day, that's just not scalable. So what we have now is we deployed PrivacyOps. We have the bots in all of our data stores, and the AI can do a much better job of searching for the data. So today, when a consumer submits a CCPA request to QuinStreet, it actually just gets directly routed to the PrivacyOps platform. the platform automatically recognizes the type of request that it is, and it automatically routes it through the right process. If it's an access or deletion request, the bots automatically trigger a search for that consumer's data, and based on what it finds, it'll tee up a response for us. So no human is involved at QuinStreet in that first process from the time the consumer submits the request until the discovery process is done, which is a huge help.
Sure, I bet. And then going beyond tackling the data discovery, what are some of the challenges in processing the subject right requests or the DSRs?
I think the biggest challenge is that there are just a lot of variables and moving pieces to keep track of, right? You have to recognize the type of request that was submitted. You've got 3 types of requests: access requests, opt-out requests, deletion requests. So you have to then make sure that that request is being processed through the rules and according to the process that you set up. There's a lot of communication with the consumer. You have to send confirmation emails. There's response templates that have to be set up for each type. If it's an opt-out request, you probably have to integrate it with your existing consumer rights management systems. So, and then of course you have to keep track of all the different response deadlines for each of those requests. You have to have an audit trail. And if the proposed regs are finalized as they're currently drafted, many of us are actually going to have to publicly display a count of how many requests you received, what type of requests, how long it took you to answer them. So there's just a lot of information. And then back to whether you're holding data as a controller or as a service provider, you're also going to have to route that request in a different way and potentially notify the ultimate controller of that data. So it's a lot of moving pieces. We turn to PrivacyOps to help us streamline that process, and the platform does all the heavy lifting for us. As I mentioned, the request goes through the platform automatically. The templates get sent out, email responses get sent to the consumer without our involvement, and then we have dashboards where we can track requests by type, by deadline, by action taken. We have all the audit trail there, and we've got dashboards, and we can see on a very granular basis how many requests we've received, of what type, how many we've closed, what the average close time is, and so on. And most of that happens without any human involved. Right now, we have one person who is monitoring and looking at the requests, and for the time being, we still want to review, of course, responses particularly to access requests, because we're very careful. We want to be very careful about any data that we're disclosing. But other than that, there really is, the entire process now is automated.
Great. And the concerns about review are a really good point. As we've heard concerns that the data subject rights process mandated by these new regulations might be exploited by malicious actors, and they're looking to gain access to someone's personal data. What can organizations do to help mitigate that threat?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question, and I think that was probably the area of greatest concern for us, and it still is. So, for some companies that have registered users or that have users that have set up accounts, you may already have two-factor authentication or more sophisticated verification methods. But for others, there's a huge vulnerability there. So we don't have registered users per se. We just have consumer data and data that the consumer provided to us. So one of the lessons I think that has been learned from the GDPR is that malicious actors can fairly easily exploit these requests and gain access to data that's not theirs. So you likely all heard of the researcher who was able to access his fiance's information, including sensitive information. I think he sent about 150 requests. A quarter of the companies that he sent in requests to gave him information with only an email and a phone number. And then another big percentage gave him information based on documents, but those documents were really easy to forge. So you really have this trade-off between what level of verification are you going to impose on the consumer to ensure the consumer's security. But then every time you add a verification method, you're adding hurdles for the consumer to exercise those rights. So you have this trade-off between verification and the ease of the consumers to exercise their rights. So I think verification will depend on the systems you have in place.